So I want to talk about ways of looking at the world and how that interacts with the people that we study and the people who do the studying. Um, so I'm going to start with the March for Science, which was notable in lots of ways. Any of you participate in the March for Science? Absolutely. Well, one of the people who participated was Robin Kimmerer, and she had a banner like this that said, "Let's march not just for science, but for sciences." Robin is on your right there. She heads the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. And her banner plus the talk she gave at, I'm not sure where she was marching, triggered a lot of responses, discussion, and I'm just going to show you a couple of pieces of one that was on, I think there's some radio station called The Skeptical, or a program called The Skeptical Inquirer or something like that. So here's what a couple of people said. I read through the whole statement. What did they mean by indigenous science? I don't like the fact that they talk about quote unquote Western science. That's problematic. It's tough, right? Of course, we need to be sensitive to the fact that science is done by people. There's a rich and not so savory history of science, ignoring certain types of people and not thinking of their perspectives when science is done. But there's a fine line. If I'm taking a maximally charitable view for interpretation of what they're saying, there are different ways of approaching science from an ethical and societal point of view. There aren't different methods of science. Indigenous science is science in a way that is sustainable, that respects local cultures. But that has nothing to do with the process of science. But when they start talking about paradigms and epistemologies and other ways of knowing, they're dancing up to a line there. Multiple sciences? No. Just a little side observation. So what I want to focus on today is ways of conceptualizing the world that are culturally variable. And I'm going to argue that science doesn't correspond to just a single way of looking at the world, and that we need to take into account both forms of diversity if we're going to have a successful science. So the particular cultural comparisons involve work that Megan and I and a host of other people, I could take most of the time from my talk just telling you who the other people were and what they've done. We're looking at Native American, European American contrasts. There are 560 some federally recognized tribes. So when I say Native American, I'm already overly generalizing. So we primarily focused on two sites. The American Indian Center of Chicago, which is an intertribal community organization, the oldest urban Indian center in the country. Probably more than 100 tribes represented by members of the tribe. And also the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin, a ways north and west of Green Bay. And our third site is Northwestern University. So the Menominee are the oldest continuous residents of Wisconsin. There once something like 9 million acres that they would occupy has been reduced to 234,000 acres. They're famous for their sustainable forestry practices. So a lot of the data that I'm going to tell you about come from rural Native American Menominee children contrasted with nearby rural European American children and adults. But also, we contrast Chicago area Native American with non-native samples. Okay, so here are some of the dimensions of difference that we've looked at. Megan mentioned one of these yesterday, psychological distance from the rest of nature. An ecological or relational focus versus a taxonomic focus. Thinking in terms of asymmetrical linear relationships versus reciprocal relationships. And perspective taking. So I'll tell you about the first kind of data collection. Thanks, Christine, for introducing the idea of using lots of different methods for data collection. So the data I'm going to tell you about came from some initial interviews where we asked community members, tell me the 5 most important things you'd like your child or your grandchild to learn or know about the biological world. So we collected those data. We coded them in various ways. I will tell you, in rural Wisconsin, one of the things that both native and non-native parents say is they want their kids to be able to recognize poison ivy, which is a pretty sensible thing. But there were huge differences in terms of distancing discourse. If you were rural European American, you would talk about nature as an externality. I want my children to respect nature, know they have a responsibility to take care of it, etc. Native Americans, both in Chicago and on the Menominee Res, instead tended to say things like, I want my children to understand that they are a part of nature. We also collected data with children and adults, both in Chicago and in rural Wisconsin, on outdoor practices, and then categorized their outdoor practices in terms of whether they tended to foreground or background nature. So playing basketball outside, we'd code as, or actually we had other people code. They would tend to say nature tends to be backgrounded when you're playing basketball outside. You're going for a walk in the woods, you're foregrounding. I don't want to get into a debate about foregrounding and backgrounding where nature is, but at least by those criteria with our coders, for both urban and rural native samples, the outdoor activities tended to foreground nature by our coders' ratings relative to the non-native populations, where it was more likely that these practices were more backgrounding. Yesterday, Megan told you about looking at Google images and depictions of ecosystems, where the striking observation is how absent people are from those depictions. We're doing some work where we're trying to explore why this might matter. So if you think of humans as outside the system, what are some of the consequences? One that we started to explore, that Bethany has explored in Panama, is using a task that Peter White developed, trying to elicit ecological models by asking college students about relationships. If one kind of factor changes, how will that affect other factors? So if population increases, how will this affect income? Or he's also looked at things related to environmental factors. And what Bethany has found, at least so far, is, well, first of all, I'll say Peter White finds very simple models, and they tend to be linear, no kind of feedback processes. With more expert samples, indigenous versus non-indigenous, you get much more complex models, but the non-indigenous experts see humans as agents rather than patients, and Nobe see humans as both agents and patients. So one way to think about it is if you're outside the system, you can lob things into it and mess it up, but the system's not going to lob them back at you. If she'd done her interviews after the last couple of weeks of hurricanes, maybe she would have found more humans as patients. So that's another thing we're going to be exploring with different kinds of U.S. Forestry Service personnel, because we think there'll be some interesting variation there. I'm going to run through quickly, I hope, some studies on hunting and fishing experts, a little bit on developmental studies that continue to show the same pattern of cultural differences. So a lot of the work we've done is with Menominee and non-native majority culture fishing experts from north central Wisconsin. I say they're experts because they've been fishing for 40 or more years, but also because they have been nominated by community members as having special expertise. And later on, we were able to verify that by, again, asking for people who had as much experience, but maybe not so much expertise. And we found reliable differences between those two sets of nomination groups. So both groups engage in similar fishing activities, fish all year except when the Packers are playing a game. Menominees tend to focus more on fishing as a source of protein. To some extent, European American experts focus more on fishing as a sport. But everyone eats fish up there, so it's not all catch and release. So the first study I'm going to tell you about was Joe kind of laid out yesterday. We give people the names of local species of fish. We ask them to put them into groups in a way that makes sense to them. And then we use cultural consensus modeling to try to establish whether there's a consensus, and then look for within and between group differences, and somewhat simplifying the results. Basically, European American fishing experts overwhelmingly sort taxonomically in terms of goals. So they talk about fish that are good for kids to catch, prestigious game fish, garbage fish, etc. Menominee experts are far more likely to sort ecologically. In some cases, you get some description of goals. And from other things that they say, they're much less likely to make these evaluative judgments about fish. And we followed up these results with the same less expert samples I alluded to before, trying to see if there are changes with expertise, but we found exactly the same pattern, and if anything, the cultural differences are exaggerated. So less expert European American fishermen are more likely still to focus on goals. We also probed for fish-fish interactions. I think we took 21 species of fish. We gave all possible pairs of those fish, and we would say something like, does the walleye affect the northern, or does the northern affect the walleye? If you do the combinatorials on this, you realize we're asking quite a few questions, maybe 210, is that right? So it was not explicitly a speeded task. But since we were asking 210 questions in an hour, it quickly became a somewhat speeded task. Menominee experts were more likely to mention positive relations, more likely to mention reciprocal relations, and they were relations involving all stages in the life cycle of fish. European American experts mention fewer relations, and they primarily involve adult fish. This was a little bit puzzling because these guys, mostly guys, are really experts. And in fact, some of the things that the European American experts failed to mention, one example is northern, they look like barracuda. They have a larger cousin called muskies, and we would ask about, does the northern affect the muskie or the muskie affect the northern? And if you're European American, you say, yeah, a muskie will eat a northern. But in a different setting, these same guys, we would hang out with these guys. We would hear them say things like, northern hatch out 2 weeks in the spring earlier than muskies, and northern fry will eat muskie fry. So we thought it was puzzling that that didn't come out on the task. So we slowed the task down on the theory that the two groups had the same knowledge, but it was organized differently. So we were asking questions that were easy, given the knowledge organization of Menominees, to generate answers, and would be a little more complicated to, or at least we thought, for European American experts. And that's what we found. When we slowed down the task, the cultural differences disappeared, and the European American experts started to answer questions in terms of all the stages in the life cycle of fish. As Christine knows, I dwell on this because this may be the only time in my life that I made a prediction about a result that actually turned out. So other kinds of studies that we've done, we've looked at human-animal asymmetries in inferential reasoning. So Susan Carey made famous, well, actually my colleague Lance Rips originated this, at least in psychology, the idea of attributing a natural, an unfamiliar biological property to some organism and then asking about generalizability. So Susan Carey did this work where she would say, dogs have a little green thing inside them called an omentum. Do you think a turtle also has an omentum? Do you think people also have an omentum? And one of the reasons that Susan thought that children's biology developed out of psychology is she found that humans were a great base for induction. If you attributed a property to humans, they were quite likely, young kids, 4 and 5-year-old kids, were quite likely to extend this property to other animals. But if you used a dog as a base, they were considerably less likely. And it follows from what I've said that she also found huge human-dog, dog-human asymmetry. So if you attribute a property to humans, kids think it's quite likely that dogs have it. But if you attribute it to dogs, they're unlikely to think that humans have it. Susan Carey's studies were done with 4 and 5-year-old urban kids. We find if we go to rural Wisconsin, a dog is just as good a base for induction as a human. But if you're European American, we find human-dog asymmetries in reasoning. If you're a Menominee kid, we don't see those. Okay, I'm going to kind of try to speed up a little bit, but I do want to tell you about attention to context, because I think this is another kind of interesting experimental manipulation. So here's the experiment we did. We said to our experts, tell us about the last time you went fishing. And then we counted the number of words that you said before you mentioned fish. And it turns out, if you're a European American, the median was the 27th word. If you're Menominee, the median was the 83rd word. And the reason we used medians is because some of our Menominee participants never got around to mentioning fish. And Megan yesterday mentioned another difference, the same kind of food chains versus food webs as a difference. So many, but far from all, of these differences can be understood in terms of subjective proximity or psychological distance to the rest of nature. And now I want to carry this distance orientation, despite the fact that it's a great oversimplification. I want to turn that to the issue of researcher diversity. So commonly in the literature and in public discourse, the primary arguments for researcher diversity center around equity and fairness. At the national academies, we also talk about the gathering storm of shifting demographics and science not being a very popular field. And if you're excluding minorities, you're throwing away the potential of a great resource. So the National Academies wants to increase researcher diversity because we have a bigger pool of talent to draw on. But what about factors intrinsic to science itself? So one way of thinking about science as a social activity, since it is one, is that science is truth, quote unquote, plus some errors in measurement, plus systematic biases. But our science is a public discipline. We argue, we have our favorite theories, and the idea is that the sociology of science cancels out any systematic biases, and random errors ultimately should cancel out. But there's a problem with that. If science is dominated by a culturally narrow group or a non-diverse group of individuals, then there may be bias, including a cultural bias or a power bias, that resists change. So we've been criticizing psychology, but if anything, it's more true in anthropology, that the history of our fields have reflected identification with the people in power, colonialist orientation. So it's not obvious that science cancels out all kinds of bias. And I thought about raising for discussion, okay, when did this stop? We know that anthropology was bad in the 19th century. Can we mark a year where all of this stopped? And then Heidi gave a talk yesterday that made me think that our best chance is that sometime in 2017 it stopped. But okay, so then there's a model of science that is a little more sophisticated. So in addition to these other kinds of biases, we add a power bias and a cultural bias. And then the argument is we need a sociology of a diverse science to address these kinds of biases. So on this view, the primary role of diversity is kind of a watchdog role. So If I'm black and you're coming up with the questionnaire items and they're just bad items, they won't be understood in my community or they reflect prejudice, I will correct that. So the idea is that if we have enough watchdogs, we'll get these cultural biases and power biases out of science. I think it's relevant, but I don't think it goes nearly far enough. So I don't think the way we do science allows us to decompose what we do into a bias part and a truth-finding part. I think trying to do a science without values is like trying to paint a picture without taking a perspective. I think values are implicit in our practices, what gets studied, how we study it, epistemologies and framework theories, ways of looking at the world. If I had time, I could go into detail. I'll just say a little bit. Well, the way Japanese primatologists went about studying primates was quite different from US, and it led to different patterns of discovery, different understandings of how dominance plays out, the role of female macaques in male dominance, et cetera, et cetera. There are corresponding studies of moral cognition where we start with Kohlberg's theory of moral development, stage theory of moral development, which turned out to be a very masculine model of moral development. Carol Gilligan brought in a more US female perspective and the psychology of caring. And then when cross-cultural work tried to apply Kohlberg's model in other cultures, you just got bizarre results like Buddhist monks are in a very primitive stage of moral development, et cetera. Okay. I also think that in our sciences, intuition is a blessing and a curse. So for those of you who work with non-human primates, you know that lots of times you have to do a lot of guesswork, or maybe with dogs even more. We really rely on our intuitions, but our intuitions are not acultural and universal. And that means when we use our intuition to develop materials and take them to another culture or another community, we're probably carrying along an additional source of bias. Another factor that can affect, I think, how we conceptualize whatever we're interested in studying is the psychological distance between us and who we're studying. Example like this is some work by Michael Chandler. He was looking at suicide rates among First Nations people in British Columbia. First Nations people in British Columbia have an extremely high suicide rate. If you took that as the right unit of aggregation, you could say, well, we've got to do all this policy work. We've got to go into these communities, deal with these bands, and figure out how we can help them. But what Michael did is he first broke the data down by band, and he found that 40% of the communities had a suicide rate of 0. So you probably wouldn't want to spend millions of dollars to address suicide in those communities. He also looked at different factors that might be correlated with suicide rate. The ones that may be intuitive to you might be, I don't know, unemployment, income, urbanization. None of those correlated across his sample. What did work was really the number of measures a band was doing to assert its sovereignty, keep its language vital, and keep the culture vital. So if you had on this list of, I guess it's 9 factors, if you had like 7 or more of these factors in play, your suicide rate was 0. So the kind of conclusion you would have drawn if you just took British Columbia First Nations and your understanding of it is really quite fundamentally different than if you start to work at the level of bands. If you paid careful attention to Bill Batchelder's talk, you can imagine other ways of pushing yourself toward productive levels of analysis. The last issue I want to mention is one that's become more and more important to me. We are fortunate in our School of Education and Social Policy to have a number of graduate students of color. But they often want to work in their own communities. A Latina student wants to work in a Latina community, Latino-Latina community, but they often get all these warnings like maybe you're getting too close, and maybe your research is biased, or this is starting to seem like advocacy research. And if there's time in the discussion this afternoon, I'll give you a really salient example of where this came up. So the question is a distance perspective essential to good science, or is it a particular cultural model for doing science? So I'm just realizing this isn't necessary. I didn't quite get you the final version of my talk. So in the slide I had, I actually named my colleagues, but it's probably good that I didn't. I'm working with some colleagues now who have been the most vocal about advocacy research. I'll tell you later, Megan, if you're interested. So my colleagues and I, and a couple of grad students working with me, Kalonji and Zinga for one, we first started out making a list of potential researcher biases. And I think we have about 30 right now. And then we, at least at this stage, we don't have IRB approval to use a wider sample. We ask ourselves whether a particular form of bias would be equally likely if you were close and engaged versus more distant, or whether one form might be more likely if you are close and engaged versus distant. So our consensus is that p-hacking, where you do lots of analyses, is probably more likely when you're engaged, when you're more engaged research. Now, one reason for that is there's been so much research with weird populations that a lot of the issues that come up, that develop across time, have been settled. So arguably, when you're doing work that's exploratory and relatively novel, you should be doing lots of tests, analyzing your data lots of different ways. Another source of bias is in-group bias in comparative studies. So asking non-weird people to answer questions that were designed for weird participants. We think that's more likely with a distance perspective. The remarkable thing so far is my colleagues and I have pretty much agreed on this. And I think maybe the issue is going from the abstract accusation of advocacy research to the very concrete question of, okay, tell me in detail how these different sources of biases might creep in. So I'll just stop here. Conclusions, there are different ways of looking at the world, both at the level of the researched and the researcher. And I think they're crucial to the success of our enterprise. Psychological distance is just one component of this variation. I apologize for this kind of oversimplified orientation. I think there's a need for conventional, distanced, disinterested research, but also for an engaged, closer perspective. So I'll stop there. Thanks.